He wasn't supposed to be homeless. Not after everything he'd survived. Not after the desert heat, the long nights, the promises made under foreign skies that men like him would never be left behind. But life doesn't always follow the rules written in service manuals, and on a cold November night just outside Spokane, Washington, Lucas Carter sat in the front seat of his aging pickup truck with nothing but a worn duffel bag, a half-empty tank of gas, and a German shepherd who refused to leave his side. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and distant chimney smoke, drifting through a cracked window that wouldn't quite close, and every breath Lucas took felt heavier than the last, like the weight of everything he hadn't said catching up to him all at once. He stared through the fogging windshield at the quiet street ahead, lined with darkened homes and porch lights that flickered like distant stars, each one belonging to someone who still had a place to go inside. He used to have that. Not much, but enough. A small apartment, a steady routine, the illusion of forward motion. Until the notice came. Until the job dried up. Until the landlord's voice turned from polite to final. Now it was just him and Shadow. The dog sat upright in the passenger seat, his silhouette steady and alert, ears forward, eyes fixed on something Lucas couldn't yet see. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was trained, disciplined, shaped by commands and missions. But there was something else in him too. Something quieter, something that didn't come from any handler or field exercise. Instinct, maybe, or something closer to faith. Lucas rubbed a hand over his face, rough with stubble, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. "We'll figure it out," he muttered, though the words felt thin the moment they left his mouth. Shadow didn't react. He didn't need to. His gaze had shifted now, locked beyond the row of houses, toward a narrow side road Lucas hadn't noticed before. It curved gently past a broken fence and disappeared into a stretch of overgrown land where one structure stood alone in the dark. An old house, weathered siding, windows clouded with dust and time. Lucas followed the dog's line of sight, squinting through the dim light. "That place," he said under his breath. He hadn't thought about it in years. His grandmother's house, left behind after she passed, tied up in paperwork no one wanted to deal with, dismissed by the rest of the family as more trouble than it was worth. To them, it was nothing. To him, it was a memory he hadn't been ready to open. Shadow let out a low sound, not quite a bark, not quite a whine, just enough to break the silence. Then he stood, one deliberate movement. No hesitation. Lucas watched him, something stirring beneath the fatigue, a quiet pull he couldn't explain. "You really want to go there?" he murmured. The dog stepped down from the seat and nudged the door with his nose. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of damp wood and earth, like something long buried waiting to be remembered. Lucas hesitated only a moment longer before reaching for the handle. Sometimes, when everything is taken from you, the only thing left to do is follow the one thing that still believes there's something ahead. And Shadow already knew where to go. The gravel beneath Lucas Carter's boots crunched softly as he stepped out into the cold, the sound sharp in the stillness of the night, like the world itself was listening to his every move. The truck door shut behind him with a hollow thud, and for a moment he just stood there, hands tucked into the pockets of his worn jacket, staring at the narrow path leading toward the house. It had been years since he had last seen it, but something about it felt unchanged, as if time had passed everything else by and settled here instead. Shadow moved ahead without waiting, his paws silent against the dirt, his body low and focused, like he was following a trail only he could see. Lucas exhaled slowly, watching the faint cloud of his breath drift into the dark air. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than to the dog. "I am coming." The path was overgrown, weeds brushing against his jeans, catching at the fabric as he walked, and the closer he got, the more the details came into view. The porch sagged slightly on one side, the paint long faded and peeling, the front door marked with the soft scars of weather and time. A single porch light hung above it, unlit, its glass clouded with dust. Lucas reached the steps and paused, his hand hovering just above the railing. He could almost hear her voice. His grandmother had never raised it, never needed to. She had been the kind of woman who filled a room without trying, who made a place feel steady just by being in it. He swallowed, pushing the memory down before it could take hold, and reached for the door. It opened easier than he expected, the hinges letting out a long, low creak that echoed through the empty house. The air inside was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of old wood, dry paper, and something softer beneath it, something that had not entirely faded. Home, or at least the memory of it. Shadow slipped past him immediately, moving with quiet purpose, his nose low as he began to scan the room. Lucas stepped in after him, closing the door behind him with a gentle push, as if noise alone might disturb whatever remained here. The floorboards groaned under his weight, each step a reminder that this place had been standing long before his problems began and would likely stand long after they were gone. A thin layer of dust covered the furniture, draped in sheets that softened their shapes into something almost ghost-like. Lucas ran his fingers along the back of a chair as he passed, leaving a clean line through the dust. Still standing, he murmured, though he was not sure if he meant the house or himself. Shadow did not stop. He moved through the living room, past the narrow hallway, straight toward the back of the house where the kitchen opened into a darker corner Lucas remembered all too well. The basement door. It stood at the far end, half hidden in shadow, its surface marked by deep scratches and the faint outline of a lock that had not been touched in years. Lucas slowed as he approached, his chest tightening with something he could not quite name. That door had always been off limits when he was a kid, not forbidden in words, but in tone, in the way his grandmother would gently steer him away whenever he got too close. "Nothing down there you need to worry about," she would say, her voice calm but final. He stopped a few feet away now, staring at it like it might answer a question he had not yet asked. Shadow stood directly in front of the door, completely still, his ears forward, his gaze fixed. Then, slowly, he lifted one paw and placed it against the wood. A soft scratch. Not frantic, not uncertain. Intentional. Lucas felt something shift inside him, a quiet pull that did not come from logic or reason, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere that recognized the moment before it fully understood it. He stepped closer, his hand rising toward the handle, hesitating just long enough to feel the weight of everything that had led him here. Outside, the wind brushed softly against the house, whispering through the cracks like a breath held too long. Inside, there was only silence, and the steady presence of a dog who had already decided that whatever waited on the other side of that door was meant to be found. The handle was colder than Lucas expected, the metal pressing into his palm with a quiet finality that made him hesitate just long enough to hear his own heartbeat echo in the stillness of the house. Shadow did not move. He remained fixed at the door, his body steady, his attention absolute, as if whatever lay beyond was not a question to him, but a certainty. Lucas swallowed, tightening his grip, and slowly turned the handle. It resisted at first, stiff from years of neglect, then gave with a dull click that seemed louder than it should have been. The door opened inward with a long, dragging creak, revealing a narrow staircase that disappeared into darkness. The air that rose from below was different from the rest of the house. Cooler, damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and something older, something that had not seen light in a very long time. Lucas reached for the switch on the wall, his fingers brushing against it before pressing down. Nothing. No flicker. No hum. Just darkness. Figures, he muttered under his breath. He stepped back, glancing toward the kitchen, then returned with a small flashlight he found in a drawer, its beam weak, but steady enough to cut through the shadows. Shadow moved first, descending the steps with careful precision, each paw placed deliberately, his body low but unafraid. Lucas followed, one hand brushing the wall for balance as the wood beneath his boots groaned softly with each step. The beam of light shifted with his movement, catching fragments of what lay below. Old shelves lined the walls, cluttered with boxes, jars, and tools that had not been touched in years. A workbench stood against the far side, its surface covered in a thin film of dust, and in the corner, a stack of wooden crates sat undisturbed, like they had been waiting for someone who never came back. When Lucas reached the bottom, he paused, taking in the space. It was not large, but it felt heavy, as if it carried more than just the weight of forgotten things. He exhaled slowly, the sound louder in the enclosed space, and swept the light across the room again. Nothing obvious. No answers. Just pieces of a life that had been quietly packed away. "So this is it," he said, though the words did not carry much conviction. Shadow did not agree. The dog moved past him, nose close to the ground, weaving through the narrow paths between boxes with a quiet urgency that did not match the stillness of the room. Lucas watched him for a moment, then followed, the beam of the flashlight tracing the dog's path. Shadow stopped near the far wall, just beside the workbench, where the concrete floor met a section of old wooden planks that looked slightly different from the rest. He lowered his head, sniffing once, twice, then began to paw at the surface. Not aggressively, not frantically, just enough to draw attention. Lucas stepped closer, narrowing the light. "What is it, boy?" he asked softly. The wood bore faint marks, lines that did not quite match the pattern of the surrounding floor, like something had been placed there intentionally rather than built with the rest. Lucas crouched, running his fingers along the edge. There was a gap, small, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from something else, something quieter and heavier. Recognition, not of the object itself, but of the moment, the kind that does not happen by accident. Shadow stepped back slightly, giving him space, his eyes fixed on Lucas now instead of the floor, as if waiting. Lucas hesitated only a second before pressing his fingers into the gap and pulling. At first, nothing happened. Then the wood shifted, lifting just enough to break the seal of years, releasing a soft, dry sound as it came free. Beneath it, darkness again, but different this time. Deeper, intentional. Lucas adjusted the flashlight, angling it downward, and the beam revealed the edge of something hidden below. Not large, not obvious, but placed there with care. He drew in a slow breath, the air catching in his lungs as the realization settled over him. This had not been forgotten. This had been left. And somehow, against every reasonable explanation, they had been led right to it. Lucas Carter did not reach for it right away. He stayed crouched there, the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand as the beam hovered over the hidden space beneath the floor. The air felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the room itself had shifted, aware that something long buried had finally been seen. Shadow stood just behind him, close enough that Lucas could feel the warmth of the dog's presence against the cold edge of the moment, steady and unwavering. "You knew," Lucas whispered, though he did not expect an answer. The dog's ears twitched, his gaze calm, patient, as if waiting for Lucas to catch up to something already understood. Slowly, Lucas lowered himself further, setting the flashlight down on the floor so its beam angled into the opening. Both hands now free, he reached inside. His fingers brushed against wood. Smooth but aged. A box. Not large. Not heavy. But deliberate. He tightened his grip and lifted it carefully, the edges clearing the opening with a soft scrape before he brought it fully into the light. Dust clung to its surface, dulling what might once have been a rich finish, but even beneath that, there was care in its design. Simple, solid, meant to last. Lucas turned it slightly in his hands, his thumb tracing the faint outline of a carved pattern along the lid. It was familiar in a way he could not immediately place, like a memory just out of reach. For a moment, he just held it there, the silence stretching around him, the weight of it settling deeper than the object itself. Then he exhaled and lifted the lid. Inside, there was no gold, no stacks of cash, nothing that would have answered the kind of problems that had brought him here in the first place. Instead, there were papers, neatly folded, tied together with a thin, faded ribbon. Beneath them, a small envelope, yellowed at the edges, and something else, heavier, metallic, resting at the bottom. Lucas frowned slightly, the expectation he had not realized he carried slipping quietly away. "All this, for papers?" he murmured, though the words lacked disappointment. It was not that simple. He could feel it. Carefully, he set the box on the floor beside him and untied the ribbon. The papers unfolded with a soft crackle, the sound of age rather than neglect, and as the flashlight beam settled over the first page, the shape of things began to change. Legal documents, titles, names, his grandmother's name, and beneath it his. Lucas blinked, his breath catching as he read more closely, his eyes moving faster now, scanning lines that did not make sense at first, and then suddenly did. Property, not just this house. More. Land. Accounts. Holdings that had been transferred, secured, protected in ways that suggested intention, not oversight. He sat back slightly, the paper still in his hands, the the world narrowing to the quiet realization forming in his chest. "No, this doesn't," he started, but the words fell away. Shadow shifted beside him, lowering himself onto the floor, his head resting lightly against Lucas's knee, grounding him in something real as the pieces continued to fall into place. Lucas reached for the envelope next, his fingers slower now, more careful. It was sealed, but not tightly, as if it had been meant to be opened one day, just not too soon. He slid a finger beneath the flap and lifted it, pulling out a single sheet of paper, thinner than the others, handwritten. The sight of it alone was enough to stop him. He knew that handwriting. He had not seen it in years, but some things do not fade. His grandmother's words, steady and deliberate, filled the page. Lucas swallowed hard, his eyes moving across the lines as the meaning unfolded, not in a rush, but in a quiet, deliberate way that felt almost like a conversation. She had known, not everything, but enough. Enough to understand that life would not always be kind to him, that there would be a moment when he would stand with nothing left and wonder if any of it had meant anything at all. And she had prepared for that moment, not by leaving something obvious, but by leaving something that had to be found. Lucas lowered the paper slightly, his vision blurring. At the edges, though he did not move to wipe it away. "You waited," he said softly, not sure if he was speaking to her, to the house, or to the quiet space that had held this for so long. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor, a slow, steady motion. Not excitement, not urgency, just presence. Lucas looked back down at the box, at the documents, at the small metallic object still resting at the bottom, untouched. Whatever this was, it was not an accident. It was not luck. It was something set in motion long before he ever thought he would need it. And somehow, against everything that should have kept him away, he had come here anyway. Lucas Carter did not touch the metal object right away. His hand hovered above it, fingers slightly curled as if the space between them held something fragile, something that could vanish if handled too quickly. The flashlight cast a narrow beam across the inside of the box, catching the faint glint of the object beneath the papers. And for a moment, Lucas simply watched it, the silence pressing in around him like a held breath. Shadow remained close, his head still resting against Lucas's leg, the steady warmth grounding him in a way nothing else could. "All right," Lucas murmured, more to steady himself than anything else, and slowly reached down. The metal was cool when his fingers closed around it, heavier than he expected for its size. He lifted it carefully into the light, turning it just enough for the details to come into view. It was a key. Not modern, not simple. The kind of key that belonged to something built with intention, its edges worn smooth by time, its surface marked with faint engravings that caught the light in quiet patterns. Lucas studied it, his brow tightening slightly as recognition stirred again, not fully formed, but present. His grandmother had always kept things like this, not out of habit, but out of meaning. Nothing in her house had ever been random. Every object had a place, a reason. And this had been hidden, protected, left where it would only be found when it needed to be. He glanced back at the papers spread across the floor, the names and numbers that had already begun to reshape his understanding of everything he thought he had lost. Then, back to the key. "What do you open?" he asked softly, though the question did not feel like one meant to be answered out loud. Shadow shifted slightly at his side, lifting his head, his ears angling forward again, his attention no longer on Lucas but on the room itself. The dog stood slowly, moving a few steps away, his nose lifting as he drew in the air, searching. Lucas watched him, something tightening in his chest again, that same quiet pull that had led them here in the first place. "You are not done, are you?" he said under his breath. Shadow did not look back. He moved past the workbench, past the shelves, toward the far corner of the basement where the wall met a section of older stone that did not match the rest of the foundation. Lucas rose to his feet, the key still in his hand, and followed, the beam of the flashlight trailing after the dog. The air felt cooler there, the scent of damp earth stronger, and as the light settled over the wall, the details came into focus. It was not just stone. It was a door, small, nearly invisible unless you knew to look for it. Its outline hidden in the irregular pattern of the blocks, the seam barely visible beneath years of dust and shadow. Lucas stopped a few feet away, his breath slowing, his mind catching up to what his eyes were seeing. No way. he whispered, though the words carried more awe than disbelief. Shadow stood directly in front of it, still and certain, his gaze fixed on the exact point where the seam met the edge of the frame. Lucas stepped closer, raising the flashlight, and there it was. A lock. Old. Solid. Waiting. He looked down at the key in his hand, then back at the door, the connection settling into place with a quiet, undeniable clarity. This had not been random. Not the box. Not the papers. Not even the path that had brought him here tonight. Every piece had been set, waiting for a moment when he would have nothing left to rely on except the one thing that could not be taken from him. Trust. He exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest shifting, not gone, but different now. Lighter in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. All right, he said. Again, this time steadier, as he stepped forward and reached for the lock. Shadow moved just enough to give him space, his presence constant, his silence louder than any words. Lucas slid the key into the lock, the metal fitting with a precision that left no room for doubt, and for a brief moment, he closed his eyes, not in fear, but in recognition of what this meant. Then he turned it. The lock turned with a sound that did not belong to force, but to time finally giving way. A soft, deliberate click echoed through the basement, and for a moment, Lucas Carter did not move. His hand remained on the key, his breath held somewhere between anticipation and something deeper, something quieter that felt almost like reverence. Shadow stood beside him, still as stone, his eyes fixed on the door as if he had been waiting for this exact moment long before Lucas ever understood it. Slowly, Lucas pulled the key free, the metal sliding out with ease now, as if its purpose had already been fulfilled. He placed his hand against the edge of the hidden door and pushed. It resisted at first, the seal of years pressing back, then gave way inch by inch, releasing a low, wooden groan that carried through the small space like a memory waking up. The air that slipped out from within was different from the rest of the basement. Not just cooler, but cleaner somehow, untouched, as if whatever lay inside had been protected not only from time, but from the world itself. Lucas stepped back slightly, raising the flashlight, the beam cutting through the narrow opening as the door creaked wider. What it revealed was not what he expected. Not a vault. Not piles of money or anything that matched the weight of the documents upstairs. Instead, it was a small room, carefully built, intentionally sealed. The walls were lined with shelves, not cluttered, but organized, each item placed with precision. Boxes, files, a single wooden chair in the corner, and at the center, a sturdy table that held something covered in a cloth that had faded but not deteriorated. Lucas stepped forward, drawn not by urgency, but by something steadier, something that felt like recognition without memory. Shadow followed at his side, his movements slower now, calmer, as if the search had ended and what remained was understanding. Lucas reached the table and paused, his hand hovering over the cloth. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as it rested against the surface, illuminating the edges of something beneath. He took a slow breath, then lifted the cloth. Beneath it was not treasure in the way most would expect. It was a collection, carefully preserved documents, ledgers, old photographs bound together with string, a small metal box, and resting on top of it all, centered as if it mattered more than anything else in the room, was another letter. Lucas stared at it for a moment, the shape of his grandmother's handwriting unmistakable even before he picked it up. His fingers moved more slowly now, more deliberately, as if the act of touching it carried weight beyond the physical. He opened it gently, the paper soft with age but intact, and as his eyes moved across the first lines, something inside him shifted in a way that had nothing to do with money or survival. It was her voice, not in sound, but in presence. Steady, clear, certain. She had not just left him resources. She had left him direction. Instructions woven into memory, into trust, into the understanding that what mattered most was not what was hidden here, but why it had been hidden at all. Lucas lowered the letter slightly, his gaze drifting across the room, taking in the shelves, the careful order, the quiet intention behind every item. This was not wealth meant to be spent. It was something meant to be understood. Something built over time, protected with patience, and passed forward not to save him from hardship, but to meet him in the middle of it. Shadow moved closer, his shoulder brushing lightly against Lucas's leg, grounding him again in the present. Lucas reached down without looking, resting his hand against the dog's head, his fingers threading through the familiar warmth of his fur. "You brought me here," he said softly, the words barely more than a breath. Shadow did not respond. He did not need to. Lucas looked back at the letter, then at the room, the realization settling fully now, not as a sudden shock, but as a quiet truth that had been waiting beneath everything else. This was never about what he had lost. It was about what had been waiting for him all along. And somehow, when he had nothing left, he had finally found the one place where that truth could not be taken away. Lucas Carter sat down slowly in the wooden chair, the letter still in his hands, the quiet of the hidden room wrapping around him like something alive but gentle, something that did not demand anything from him except that he be present. The flashlight rested on the table now, its beam steady, illuminating the pages, the shelves, the careful order of a life that had been built not in haste, but in patience. Shadow lay down beside him, close enough that Lucas could feel the rise and fall of the dog's breathing against his boot, a rhythm that grounded the moment in something real and unshakable. Lucas looked back down at the letter, his eyes tracing the lines again, slower this time, allowing each word to settle where it belonged. She had written about time, about how it shapes people in ways they do not always understand while they are living through it. She had written about loss, not as something to be feared, but as something that reveals what cannot be taken away. And woven between those lines, there was something else, a truth that had been waiting for him to reach a point where he could finally hear it. Lucas exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering as the tension he had carried for months, maybe years, began to shift. Not disappear, but loosen, like a knot that no longer needed to be held so tightly. He set the letter down carefully and reached for the stack of ledgers, opening the first one with a deliberate motion. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting, records that stretched back decades. Names, dates, transactions, but not in the way he expected. These were not just financial records. They were stories, each entry marked with a note, a reason, a quiet explanation of why something had been done. Loans given to people who needed a second chance. Land held not for profit, but for preservation. Decisions made not for gain, but for something steadier, something that felt almost like responsibility. Lucas leaned forward slightly, his brow tightening as he read, the pieces beginning to connect in a way that reached beyond numbers. His grandmother had not just built something. She had protected something. And now, without ever saying it directly, she had placed it in his hands. "Why me?" he murmured under his breath, though the question did not carry doubt so much as weight. Shadow lifted his head slightly, his eyes finding Lucas's, calm and steady, as if the answer was not something that needed to be spoken. Lucas let out a faint breath that almost resembled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it, only recognition. "Yeah," he said softly. "I guess I know." He closed the ledger and leaned back in the chair, his gaze moving slowly around the room again. The shelves were no longer just objects. They were pieces of intention. The room itself was no longer hidden. It was waiting. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas did not feel like he was standing at the end of something. He felt like he was standing at the beginning. Not a beginning that erased what had happened, but one that gave it meaning. He reached down, resting his hand on Shadow's head again, his fingers pressing gently into the familiar warmth of his fur. "We are not done, are we?" he said quietly. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor, slow and certain. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of the house, the wind shifted again, softer now, carrying the faintest hint of something new. Lucas sat there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle, not as emptiness, but as space. Space to breathe. Space to understand. Then, slowly, he stood, the letters still on the table, the ledgers open, the room behind him no longer hidden but known. And as he turned toward the doorway, toward whatever came next, there was one thing he understood with a clarity that did not need explanation. This was not something he had found. This was something he had been trusted with. And that made all the difference. Lucas Carter stepped out of the hidden room with a different weight in his chest, not heavier, but steadier, like something inside him had finally found where it belonged. The basement no longer felt like a place of forgotten things. It felt like a threshold, a quiet line between who he had been and who he was now beginning to understand he could become. Shadow moved beside him without hesitation, his pace calm, his presence unchanged, yet somehow more meaningful now that the path they had followed had revealed its purpose. As Lucas climbed the stairs, the faint creak of each step echoed less like emptiness and more like something waking up after a long silence. When he reached the top, he paused at the doorway, turning back just once, the flashlight beam resting on the edge of the open space below. Nothing about it looked dramatic. No shining gold, no obvious reward. But he knew better now. Some things were not meant to shine. Some things were meant to endure. He closed the basement door gently, the sound soft, deliberate, as if sealing something not away, but into place. The house greeted him differently this time. The same dust-covered furniture, the same quiet rooms, but the air felt less still, less abandoned. It felt patient. Lucas walked slowly through the living room, his eyes tracing the outlines of familiar shapes, the memories that lived just beneath the surface beginning to rise in small, quiet ways. A chair where she used to sit. A table where mornings once started with coffee and silence that was never empty. He stopped near the window, looking out into the dark yard where the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and distant pine. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, cold and practical, a reminder of the world outside this place, the one that had pushed him here in the first place. Missed calls, messages, notices, all the things that had once felt urgent, pressing, impossible to ignore. He stared at them, his thumb hovering above the screen, then slowly lowered it. Not yet. Some things could wait. Some things needed to be understood first. Shadow moved toward the front door, his ears lifting slightly, not in alertness, but in quiet awareness, as if sensing something beyond the walls. Lucas followed, opening the door and stepping out onto the porch. The night air met him with a cool breath, sharp but clean, filling his lungs in a way that felt different from before. The street was still quiet, the same row of darkened homes, the same distant lights, but he did not feel like he was standing outside of it anymore. He stood there for a moment, his hands resting on the railing, his gaze steady, not searching, not lost, just present. Shadow sat beside him, his posture relaxed, his attention forward, as if guarding something unseen but understood. Lucas glanced down at him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corner of his mouth. "You knew," he said softly, not as a question this time, but as a simple acknowledgement. Shadow's tail moved once, slow and certain, the only answer that mattered. Lucas looked back out at the quiet street, the weight of the past no longer pressing him down, but standing behind him, part of the path that had led here. The future was still uncertain. The problems were still there, waiting. But something had changed. Not outside. Inside. And that changed everything. He took a slow breath, letting it settle deep, then released it just as slowly, the tension leaving with it in a way that felt complete. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel like he was trying to hold everything together. He felt like he was finally standing on something solid. And as the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying with it the quiet promise of morning, Lucas understood something he had not been able to see before. He had not been led here to escape what he had lost. He had been led here to remember what could never be taken from him. Morning came quietly, the kind of light that does not rush the darkness away but eases it back, inch by inch, until the world remembers how to breathe again. Lucas Carter had not gone far from the porch. At some point in the night, he had leaned back against the wooden siding, the cold seeping through his jacket, his eyes closing not out of exhaustion, but out of something closer to stillness. When he opened them again, the sky had softened into pale blue, and the trees beyond the yard stood outlined in a gentle gold that made everything look a little less worn, a little more forgiving. Shadow was still there, curled beside him, alert even in rest, his presence unchanged through the passing hours, like a quiet promise that had no need to be spoken. Lucas shifted slightly, rolling his shoulders as the stiffness of the night made itself known, and let out a slow breath that carried none of the weight it had the day before. The world had not fixed itself overnight. The problems were still waiting. The calls, the notices, the uncertainty of what came next. But they no longer felt like something closing in. They felt like something he could walk toward. He pushed himself to his feet, his movement steady, his gaze moving across the yard, the house, the road beyond. Nothing about it had changed. And yet, everything had. He stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards greeting him again. But this time it did not sound like emptiness. It sounded like space. Space that could be filled. Space that had been waiting. He moved through the house with a quiet purpose now, not searching, not wandering, but noticing. The way the light fell across the table. The way the dust shifted when he brushed his hand along a surface. The way the silence no longer pressed against him, but stood beside him, steady and calm. Shadow followed, his steps light, his attention soft now, no longer guiding, but accompanying. Lucas stopped in the center of the room and looked around once more, taking it in not as something abandoned, but as something entrusted. Then he nodded, once, to no one in particular, and turned toward the back of the house. The basement door waited where he had left it, closed but no longer hidden. He placed his hand on it briefly, not to open it again, but simply to acknowledge it, like you would a memory that had finally settled into its place. "I hear you," he said quietly, the words barely more than a breath. Then he stepped away. Outside, the morning had grown stronger, the light stretching further across the ground, touching the edges of things that had been unseen in the dark. Lucas walked back out onto the porch, Shadow at his side, and stood there for a moment, letting the air fill his lungs again. It felt different now. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone once more. The screen lit up the same way it had before, the same messages waiting, the same world calling him back. This time, he did not hesitate. He opened the first message, then the next, not with urgency, not with fear, but with something steadier. Understanding. One step at a time. That was all it had ever been. He slipped the phone back into his pocket and rested his hand on the railing, his gaze steady on the road ahead. Shadow sat beside him, his posture relaxed, his eyes forward, as if the journey had not ended, but simply changed direction. Lucas glanced down at him, the faintest hint of a smile returning, not forced, not fragile, but real in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. "Guess we are not done yet," he said softly. Shadow's tail moved once, slow and certain, the only answer that mattered. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the quiet rhythm of a new day beginning. And for the first time in a long while, Lucas did not feel like he was trying to hold on to something slipping away. He felt like he was finally ready to move forward. Not because everything was certain, but because something inside him was. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything.